Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 2007 Kawasaki Brute Force. And for its age of 18 years, it's in very good condition. There is virtually no rust. The plastics are in great shape, and the tread on the wheels seems to mostly be there. This, I would say, has not seen a lot of action, and the clock kind of backs that claim up because, according to this, there's only 218 hours of runtime on this machine, 689 miles. So yeah, this is still virtually new. That said, though, it is not perfect, and my friend asked if I would have a look because he says, although it does start and run, it does stall out and doesn't respond very well unless you choke it partially. So that's what he's been doing. He says also he's caught one of the carbs leaking on several occasions. So yeah, likely the carbs do need to be gone through. When driving it up here, I had the choke off and it did respond pretty well. But the thing that I noticed is that while idling, the idle was a bit erratic, and actually I could hear it popping like a lean pop. So if I had to guess, I'd say one of the pilot jets is clogged up, and likely one of the cylinders is running lean at idle. So that should be an easy fix. And I think, while it's here, we're going to go through it and just make sure it doesn't need anything else, because I know this machine really hasn't been maintained. My friend is the second owner. He's had it for 15 years. And when I asked him when the oil was last changed, he said he can't remember ever changing it. So yeah, I think at a minimum, we will get some fresh oil in there. But like I said, while we're at it, we'll just check everything and make sure it is good to go. So let's get this in the garage and dig in. Actually, before I get it in the garage, let's just get the machine restarted. I'm going to let it idle a bit so you can hear what I'm hearing before we touch those carbs. So I'm not so sure that misfire really comes through too well on the camera, but you could kind of hear it backfiring a bit when I pulled it into the garage. So hopefully cleaning the carbs will take care of that. Regardless, I don't think these carbs have ever been cleaned. So I think it is well worth the time to get those carbs out and cleaned up. So to get access to them, we're going to have to remove the seat as well as some of the plastics. We also have to get the battery in the airbox out of the way. And there's just two screws right here that you give a quarter turn each. And that should theoretically free this piece to come out. And those bolts weren't on there very tight. And I think I said earlier that the owner has done no maintenance on this, but I know he did replace this battery recently, so we know at least one thing probably doesn't need attention here. So to get this piece off right here, we have a couple bolts down here, one right there, and it looks like another here and there. So it's like that on both sides, but I think before we take this off, it'll be a lot easier if we get the airbox out of the way. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what this filter looks like. My friend said when he started this the first time this spring, it sounded like a blender down by the belt. So there was a critter for sure, at least in there. We're gonna have to take a look at that later to see if any of that nest remains. And we do have a filter, but I can tell that it is turning to dust. So we're gonna need a new one of those, or at least a pre-filter. So let's get that out and get a better look at it. And you can see the filter is really in bad shape. You know, it's just biodegrading and falling right apart. So yeah, that's not good. I think even more concerning is over here. We are missing some of the filter, and I think it was actually chewed by a mouse. You can see some nesting material there, a little bit more over there. And if you look in the airbox, you can see more evidence of that kind of going around the edges, and even a nut right there. So thankfully, the metal screen behind the filter element kept that critter out from doing some real damage. So we'll just get this piece out of the way. Looks like 4 screws going around. And I got most of that nesting material out of the way. There is still a little bit, so we're gonna have to be careful we don't drop anything down the intake. And interesting enough, some of the stuff that got vacuumed out were actually kernels of corn. So I wonder if he has like a feed bag or something close by to this machine. And you can see there's still a few kernels in here, so I'm going to try to vacuum those up. The last thing I want is a kernel of dried up corn getting into that cylinder. So when he said he first started this, it sounded like a blender. And now I'm wondering if that was just more kernels of corn down there versus actual nesting material. And the fact that I don't hear it now makes me wonder where they went. And I'm noticing actually a problem down here. Let me show you. So right here, we're looking down at the rearmost carb. You can see the slide is down. You know, it's in the idle position, which is where it should be when the machine's off. But if we look over here to the front carb, that slide's actually halfway open. And that should not be like that. There's actually a big spring pushing down. And unless the engine's revving up, you know, that slide should be down. So potentially that is stuck. Looks like we also have a mystery liquid right there. So, you know, this line right here, I am not sure what it is offhand, but it's kind of in the way. But let me reach down there and see if we can get that slide to move. And I'm pushing pretty hard up, and it's not moving. Let's see if this one moves. And yeah, this one moves freely. So that right there, I'd say is a pretty big problem. You know, even if the jets are clear, the fact that this slide is not moving at all is likely the run issue that he is experiencing. So yeah, we're on the right track. Let's keep going here. So I don't think we can go any further right now with this airbox. You know, we have 8mm bolts right here to remove and a couple of 10s going around. But the airbox, it's actually underneath this plastic piece right here. So we have to get this out first. And before we can get that out, we actually need to remove this plastic right here. So I think that is our next move here. It looks like to free this piece right here, it's just cutting one zip tie right there. And we have one as well on the other side. And then we have one 10mm headed bolt. I think this will lift out. Theoretically, we're free. It looks like we have a breather tube actually right here. We have to disconnect. And we're almost out. There's actually 2 more hoses right there that need to be disconnected. So we're getting close, but we're definitely not home free yet. You know, the next move here is to loosen up the intake boots. And to be honest, I'm not sure how I'm going to access them. I can only see one of the screws, and we have to come in from this side right here. So I'm thinking we're going to have to remove a few more things to gain the access that we need. But once those boots are loose, we can remove the fuel line. there's also a couple coolant lines coming in the bottom right here. So we need to get those disconnected as well as the bowl drains. And once that's done, we should at least be able to lift these off the engine, and then we can disconnect the throttle cable as well as the choke cables. So I know it's kind of hard to see. We have some extra wires here that I think are actually for the winch up front. So yeah, we need to get these clips off somehow. And I would say the coolant for the carburetor, it's kind of optional. I guess it depends on how you're going to ride this machine. The sole purpose of it is actually to keep the carb from icing up in the winter. So, you know, if you're using this in a cold environment, something like this could make a pretty big difference as far as reliability. But yeah, these clamps are kind of facing the wrong way here. And it's actually going into a plastic manifold. So hopefully we don't snap that off in the process here. And now we're just getting the bowl drains off. And I think that's it on the underside. So let's get the fuel line off, and we should be able to lift those carbs out. So I moved to here on the other side so you can get a little bit better look. I don't quite have the freedom of movement that I was hoping for. That's about as far up as I can get. So I need to remove this screw and that screw, and the chokes should pull out. But I think before I do that, I'm going to put a rag in the intake boots just so that screw doesn't drop down into the engine. Okay. I see why I don't have the freedom of movement that I thought I would have. Looks like the idle adjustment cable is still tied in on this side. So if I free that up, that should allow much easier access to the throttle side of things. And it would have made the choke side quite a bit easier as well. So we finally have the prize. So let's just drain the fuel out. And I think we'll start with just a bit of PB Blaster in here. I mean, we're going to have to pull the slide out. I'm thinking let's let that work its magic. And while that's setting up, we'll get the bowls off and have a look at that. All right, it's not stuck. I did push it further down, but it's not returning just with the spring force. So yeah, we'll give it a little more PB Blaster. And we should be able to pull that out when we pull these covers off. We have to check the condition of these diaphragms anyway. So let's get the bowls off. Yeah, a little bit of debris in the bottom of that bowl and some on the edges, so not terrible. And the internals look decent. So let's get the jets out, as well as the needle and the float. Needle looks to be in pretty good shape. And main jet, it's not plugged. Let's check the pilot. And a little bit of debris. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So let's flip this around and we'll get the diaphragm out. And this is actually the stuck one. And the diaphragm itself looks pretty good. So the diaphragm itself looks to be pretty good. I'm not seeing any rips or tears. You know, really the issue was just the gummed up slide. So let's refit this now that we got it out. See if it'll slide freely. And no, it's pretty crusty in there. So we're going to have to clean this for sure. In the ultrasonic, and hopefully that takes care of any gunk that's in there. So I'm going to set aside these parts. I want to keep it, you know, with this side of the carb since that's where they came from, and then we'll take apart the other side. And let's have a look here at carb number 2. And similar to the last one, although this one has a little bit less junk in the bottom. And the needle looks good over here. Let's get the jets out. Main jet's not clogged. And the pilot jet, it was a little clogged. Not completely, but certainly I wouldn't call it clear. And finally we'll get the emulsion tube. Yeah, looks pretty good. And let's get a slide out over on this side. Yeah, and this one slides out freely, though. I do feel a little grit. So, yeah. So let's soak this for a bit in the ultrasonic. It doesn't need a whole lot. And then I think we'll be in pretty good shape. Yeah, I think that's all it was. There was some sort of a buildup on the slide here. And it just made it a little bit thicker. And it's a very tight tolerance, so that was enough, I think, to cause it to stick. So I'm going to work at this. We'll get all this buildup off, and I think the slide should fit in there quite a bit better. Yeah, and that's a lot better. Still not perfect. It's a little bit rough here in the middle. But I think 5 or 10 minutes in the ultrasonic, that should take care of the rest of that buildup. So this was just WD-40 I sprayed in here. You don't want to use carb cleaner because it will destroy the gasket. And although this one looks to be in decent shape, I'm thinking I should probably get a rebuild kit anyway. You know, there is some evidence that fuel was leaking past the seal. And in some spots, it looks pretty flattened out. So I'm going to take a look online. I think I'm going to get one of those ordered up. But we'll still get this cleaned up and reassembled as much as possible. And then when the parts arrive, we'll finish it up, get it back on the machine. So the carb cleaned up pretty well. So I think we're back in business here. That said, though, I did order a rebuild kit from Moose Racing, mostly for the bowl gaskets, but it does include a few other things that I don't think we need, but we'll have them on hand just in case. But I'm thinking while we wait, let's get it together as much as we can, you know, starting with the slide that was stuck. I want to make sure that now it functions properly. You know, otherwise we might need to place an order for some additional parts. Yeah, much better. So the slide, it's moving like it should. So let's get the other one in. And we'll check this one. Yep, that one works. And so does that one. So good. Both the slides, they seem to be fixed. So I'm going to get the jets back in, and I think that's going to be it for now. Well, I think it's time to get this thing back together. I have a new air and oil filter, a new set of plugs, and most importantly, the carb rebuild kit from Moose Racing. So I've got it laid out right here. It comes with quite a few parts, most of which we don't need in this case. The main reason I got it is because it was just a little bit more than buying 2 OEM bowl gaskets. So I figured, for the price difference, you might as well have everything in case you need it. In our case, we only need the bowl gaskets, but I think I'm going to swap in the new needles as well. And then we can get this fully closed up and back on the machine. So just to keep things where they belong, I did put the left and the right bowls in their own bags. So this is the left one. It goes on here. And I don't think it really matters so much for the bowls, but it does, at least on the main jets. These are different. The one on the front, I believe, is a 138, and the back is a 142. So you don't want to mess that up, or it's not going to run right. And you can see even underneath the gasket, it was definitely leaking through. So I'm going to spend a minute, just clean it up. That way we get a good seal with the new gasket. And I might actually swap out the hardware. I mean, this stuff doesn't look terrible, but we've got some new stuff right here. It looks even better. And same thing for bowl number 2. So we'll set the needle and the float aside for now. And swap that gasket out. Well, before we get the carbs back on, there's still a few things we need to do here. I guess the first one being the report that the belt area sounded like a blender. I did not hear any evidence of that, and he said it was only the first time he started it this year. So likely there were just some kernels of corn like we saw in the airbox. And just when looking down the vent here, I don't see any evidence that any remains, but I'm thinking since we're in this far, let's just pull the bolts off the cover, tip that out of the way and make sure there's no more debris in the belt area. And I think you can see the belt looks to be in good shape, and I don't see any evidence of debris in that cover, so I think we're good. And no, I don't have the torque specs for this, but just given the size of the bolt and the fact that it's a shoulder bolt, there's really no danger in damaging the plastic. It looks like I missed a screw right there. I'm going to check the valves as well. I want to make sure the clearance is good. We're not going to have any better access than we do now. So I'm going to get the starter recoil off. We'll get this little cap off. We'll position the engine and check the clearance. That one was loose. And so is that one. Yeah, pretty much all these bolts on the starter recoil were loose for some reason. So maybe someone's been in here before. Well, it might be a little bit hard to see, but I rotated the engine until I got to the mark TR. That is the mark for the rear cylinder. So like that, we can pull the valve covers and set the clearance. Yeah, a little bit of clearance for sure in the intake. I'm gonna have to double check the specs. I think the intake is about 5 thousandths and the exhaust closer to 10. Oh, that is tight. I don't like these little 8mm bolts tight like they are. Oh, it makes me nervous. Let's try the other one. Or not. There we go. Oh, that was tight. And it's also a tight space in here. The other cylinder up front, I'm not even sure I can record that. There's like just enough room for me to get in there. I'm not sure about the camera. But it's going to be the same process that we do here, except the engine should be rotated till it says TF. Yeah, and we have clearance on the exhaust, which we knew. I mean, this engine was running pretty well. But again, since we're here, it's hard to gain access to it. And it's been 17 years, so it's worth double checking these for sure. So I double checked, and the intake is 5 thousandths. It's actually plus or minus 1,000. So right now, that's a 5. Fits in there pretty snug. But it does fit on both. Let's try a 6. That would be the absolute high side. And now, 6 does not fit, so the intake's actually perfect. The exhaust should be 9 thousandths. plus or minus 1/1000th. So let's start with a 9. I'd say it's a little bit on the tight side. Let's check the other valve. Yeah, I think this one's going to be the same. Yeah, it does fit, but it's definitely on the tight side. So let's check an 8. That is the minimum. You know, if it's less than an 8, then we're going to have to make an adjustment. Yeah, an 8 actually feels pretty good on that side. Check the other. Yeah, same thing. So both the intake and the exhaust valves, they're within spec. So I checked the front, that's within spec as well. So everything's ready to go back together. And I was just getting ready to get the starter recoil back on when I heard something dripping out of this machine. We actually have a coolant leak. And I'm not sure where that would be coming from, but I do see signs of it right there. So I'm going to look around and see if I can't figure out why we're suddenly leaking coolant. Actually, it looks like we're okay. It's one of the lines that connects to the carb. You know, I must have moved it while checking the valve. So I'm just going to plug that off for now. But I think we're okay here. I was kind of expecting that to happen when I disconnected them initially. There we go. I also got a new set of plugs for this, so we're going to swap them both out, starting with the back one. It'd be interesting to see how these plugs look too, being that the back carb is jetted a little larger at 142. And I just dropped the plug. Let me fish that out. So what I was saying before I dropped the plug down here is that it'll be interesting to see how the plugs look, given that the back carb is jetted richer than the front. And we also had a stuck slide in the front. All right, here's our prize. It is an NGK CR7E. And yeah, it looks like it was running pretty rich. Now, that right there, you know, I don't think it was wet when it came out. I think it probably landed in the antifreeze puddle that formed earlier. Anyway, let's pull the front. And this one, I would say, is not running lean, although there is a little bit of white on the strap. You know, otherwise there's a fair amount of carbon buildup. Not really that nice brown color, so they're both maybe a little bit on the rich side. Anyway, we'll get the new plugs in. You really can't see this one too well. Good luck doing this on the trail. It's also an NGK CR7E. I think it might be easiest to start with the chokes. They're a little bit fiddly. I think everything else should go together, I think, without much issue. So I'll get those in. Choke is secured. So let's rotate this around. The throttle, well, not sure how much you're going to see. But that's okay. I think you got to look at it when it came off. So I'll try to maneuver this the best I can, but there we go. So the carbs have been secured, fuel line reconnected, as well as the coolant lines and the bowl drains. So we're more or less ready to go. And I was getting ready to get the airbox reinstalled, and I started questioning what some of this stuff was connected to the airbox. I mean, we have the breather. You know, every engine, big or small, has that. But these two lines I was not familiar with. So I followed them to the bottom of the machine, and they essentially go nowhere. And this one concerned me because it seems to be full of oil, and that one's actually capped off. So I think, you know, this is likely kind of acting as a catch can for oil kind of blowing out of the breather, and that has to be periodically emptied, which I don't think anyone's done. So we're going to pull the cap, drain that out, and that way in the future when oil accumulates in here, it'll just go through the drain right there into that line. And the other line, you know, I think is just providing kind of a reference for atmospheric pressure. It jumps over to here and looks like is part of this vacuum operated system. So that's what that jumper is right there. Anyway, let's pull the drain. We'll get this oil out and then get that airbox base installed. All right, so here we are kind of under the front right wheel. And these are the two lines that are up by the carburetor. This one's open. That's the atmospheric pressure reference. And this one is the one that's capped off. That's the one that's full of oil. So let's see if we can get the cap out. and we'll let that drain. Okay, that's pretty much it. So, I don't have a manual for this machine. I'm not sure how often that's supposed to be done, but it was definitely past due. And now you can see this line is completely empty. So let's get the Airbox base reinstalled. And I'm actually going to leave the filter out for now. I know it's not going to run quite right, but I want to get the engine running and just validate we don't have any leaks. And more importantly, I want to make sure both of these slides are operating as they should. Yeah, I really don't like the wiring here for the winch. It's kind of not very well done. And it actually crosses the bar here. So, yeah, not ideal. But that is not why my friend asked me to look at this. So I'll just let him know that he might consider redoing that. Anyway, we'll get the box dropped in place loosely, and we'll get those lines reconnected and then bolt it down. So make sure you connect these up right. The one that is capped off, that one has to go to the drain, which is actually right there. So we'll connect that in to that location. And then the one that's not capped off connects over here, which is the line that jumpers over to there. And last but not least, we have the 8 bolts here that actually sandwich the Airbox to the carburetor. Now, there was some thread locker on there. You want to make sure you use that because these are kind of inside the filter area. So if one of those gets loose, then, well, there's nothing stopping it from going through the engine. So this gives you a little bit of insurance that that is not going to happen. All right, let's give this thing a try. I've got the battery reconnected. The carbs are dry, so it might take a little bit of cranking, but hopefully not too much. So I've got the choke on. Okay. Beautiful. Actually, Well, I think we're looking pretty good. Had no issues starting. It idled just fine. And I even idled it down a little bit more just to make sure it could run nice and smooth. And it had no issues at all. You know, both the slides, they were moving. The only problem I noticed is that when trying to throttle it up without choke on, you know, it would pop out of both the carburetors. So I did have to apply a little bit of choke to get past that problem. I think adding the air filter should fix that. So I'm going to do that now, and we'll try to restart it. So we'll give this another go with the Airbox fully installed. Last time it would idle fine without the Airbox and the filter. The issue was coming off of idle. It would pop out of the carburetors. So I had to give it a bit of choke. This time I'm hoping I can leave the choke fully off and idle and rev the machine out. So let's get it started and see how it responds. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Okay, good. No issues at all. So adding the Airbox back definitely solved the issue because this time I could start it with the choke off and rev it out fully. And it had no issues, no backfiring. So I think the carb issue is sorted. So let's get this fully back together and we'll bring it outside and try it out. I think it's time. This machine should get its long overdue oil change. It's really hard to see, but there's also an oil filter right there, kind of like what you'd see on your car. So we'll swap that out with a new one. That could be the original. And we'll get the new filter on. I did check the O-ring came with the other filter, and I did pre-fill this a bit. It's not filled to the top, mostly because this is sideways and it's gonna probably leak out anyway. And yeah, that looks good. We're in the safe range, maybe not quite as high as we could be. So I'm going to add a little bit more to that because the filter also isn't full. So that level is going to get a little lower once we start it. All right, that should be good for now. And let's take a look at what came out of this machine. It was pretty dark. Very dark. But there's no glitter, no shiny bits. So, you know, despite, I would say, the neglect as far as the oil goes, I think this engine is in good health. So it is a beautiful morning out, and I thought I'd take this for a test drive, just make sure it's good and have a bit of fun with it before returning it to the owner. Well, guys, that's pretty much it. This machine is back up and running again and really didn't need a whole lot to get it fixed. The biggest issue was the stuck slide, and now that that is free, this is running quite well. There's no more backfiring. It idles perfectly without choke and has no issues at all getting up to speed. So I think my friend's going to be pretty happy with this. He said it's been running poorly for the last 6 or 7 years. So now that it's running right, hopefully he gets a little bit more use out of it. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.